From orbit, the planet looks complete. A sphere turning in patient light, wrapped in white cloud and endless blue. Continents lie open like pages in an atlas. Borders are etched across them in tidy lines. Capitals glow faintly along their edges. Satellites drift overhead like sentries, circling with devotion. From this distance, Earth appears known, measured, catalogued. Every mountain labelled, every desert outlined, every forest shaded in familiar green. It gives the impression of mastery, as if humanity has stepped back far enough to see the whole board and learned every move. But the camera begins to fall, slowly at first, through cloud bands, past the thin veil of atmosphere, toward the reflective skin of the ocean. Sunlight glitters across the surface like scattered coins. Waves roll in repeating patterns. It feels calm, predictable, harmless. And then the descent does not stop. The surface breaks. Sound changes. Light bends. The bright blue softens into deeper shades, then darker ones. The clarity that existed above dissolves into suspended particles, drifting like dust in an abandoned room. Sunbeams fracture into ribbons before fading entirely. The deeper we go, the less there is to see. Above, the planet felt illuminated below. It feels unfinished. More than 70% of Earth lies beneath water. That number is often repeated casually, like a classroom fact memorized long ago. Yet few pause to consider what it means. Most of the world is not land. It is depth. And most of that depth remains mapped only in fragments. Large portions of the seabed are charted in low resolution, enough for navigation, not enough for intimacy. In the irony, we possess sharper imagery of distant Mars than of our own abyssal plains. Rovers have traced the contours of another planet, while vast stretches beneath our oceans remain abstract, translated into coarse gradients and incomplete grids. This is not exaggeration. It is how exploration unfolded. We looked outward and assumed we understood inward. So the planet we think we know is, in truth, partially imagined. History rests on what survives exposure. Archaeology studies what stays above ground long enough to be excavated. Cities are unearthed from desert sand. Temples are reclaimed from jungle. Ruins rise again into sunlight. But what of structures built along ancient coastlines? What of settlements established near rivers that no longer exist? Sea levels were not always where they stand today. During the last ice age, oceans were lower by hundreds of feet. Land extended far beyond present shores. River valleys carved across plains that are now submerged. If human communities favoured water, then as they do now, they would have lived on ground that the ocean eventually claimed. And water does not preserve history in ways that invite easy discovery. It covers gently, steadily, layer upon layer of sediment falling like slow snowfall. No dramatic collapse, no final announcement, just absorption. From space, Earth appears bright and defined. Beneath its blue surface, it becomes uncertain. The deeper we descend, the less we see. Not because nothing is there, but because we rarely look long enough. It is a simple thought, unsettling in its restraint. If most of the planet has never been observed closely, then most of its past may remain unexamined. What we call early civilization may not represent the beginning. It may represent what the water permitted to endure. The ocean is not violent in this story. It is patient. It does not erase. It waits. And perhaps what we consider humanity's first chapters were written not on land that survived, but on shores we have never truly seen. The end of the last ice age did not arrive with a single roar. There was no universal wall of water, no sudden horizon, swallowed in a day. It happened slowly, so slowly that those who lived through it may not have realized they were standing inside one of the largest transformations the planet has known. Glaciers that had pressed down upon entire continents began to melt, not in dramatic collapse, but in steady retreat. Walls of ice softened into rivers, and the sea, patient as ever, began to rise. Shorelines moved inch by inch, then foot by foot. Generations watched beaches shrink, marshes expand, low fields disappear. Entire river valleys, once threaded with freshwater streams, gradually filled with salt. What had been dry ground became tidal flats. What had been plains became seabed. Humans have always gravitated toward water. Long before written history, coastlines offered fish, shellfish, fertile soil, easy travel and trade. Even today, the majority of the world's largest cities rest near oceans or major rivers. 5,000 years ago, that pattern was visible. 12,000 years ago, it likely was too. When the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, global sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than today. That number is rarely imagined in full scale. 400 feet of vertical difference does not merely wet the edge of a beach. It redraws maps entirely. If you were to drain today's oceans by that amount, continents would stretch outward like unfolding fabric. Land bridges would connect regions now separated by water. Vast continental shelves, currently hidden, would emerge as plains, valleys, and river systems. Those submerged shelves are not small margins. They represent millions of square kilometers of former habitat. Wildlife would have roamed there. Plants would have grown in river, fed soil. And where there is water and food, humans tend to settle. Yet the sea did not rise overnight. It advanced gradually across centuries, sometimes pausing, sometimes accelerating. To the people living along those coasts, it may have felt like a long migration inland. Homes rebuilt further from the tide. Camps relocated, familiar landmarks lost beneath encroaching waves. No catastrophe was required for loss. No single apocalyptic story needed to be told. When change stretches across lifetimes, it becomes adaptation rather than disaster. And here is where the quiet implication begins to form. If early human communities lived along those now submerged plains, their dwellings, storage pits, pathways, and gathering places would not have burned or shattered. They would have been covered. Layer upon layer of sand, silt, and marine sediment settling gently above them. Over time, these sites would have become indistinguishable from the natural contours of the seafloor, unless one possessed the tools to look beneath. Archaeology, by its nature, works with what remains accessible. It uncovers buried temples in deserts, cities beneath soil, pottery beneath fields. But it rarely excavates landscapes hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. So a simple question emerges without accusation, without drama. Has our understanding of early civilization been shaped not only by what survived, but by what was easiest to reach? If entire habitable zones now rest beyond ordinary excavation, then perhaps the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It may be evidence of depth, and with that possibility settled quietly in the mind, something more unsettling begins to stir. Not just lost land, not just drowned valleys, but shapes, structures that do not look entirely natural, waiting beneath modern coastlines where those ancient shores once lay. The descent continues, deeper now, toward places where sunlight no longer reaches and sound travels farther than sight. Across different oceans off isolated islands, along continental shelves, near submerged river mouths, divers and survey teams have recorded something quietly unsettling. Stepped formations, angular terraces, ridges that run straighter than surrounding rock. At first glance, nothing about them seems impossible. Geology is capable of extraordinary architecture. Basalt can cool into near-perfect hexagonal columns. Pressure and fracture can split stone into convincing lines. Erosion, given enough time, can sculpt cliffs into deceptive symmetry. Nature is a patient engineer. Yet the camera lingers. In one region, a sequence of broad platforms descends in tiers, as though carved into descending levels. The edges are weathered, softened by currents, but they hold a hint of intention. In another site, sonar reveals a long, narrow rise extending across the seabed, like a corridor. Not a jagged ridge, but something closer to a boundary. Some structures appear layered in horizontal bands, one atop another, too regular to dismiss quickly and too ancient to interpret confidently. A few align curiously with cardinal directions, north to south, east to west, as if following a design logic once understood by someone standing on dry ground. Still, caution prevails. Marine geologists remind us that symmetry does not belong exclusively to humans. Rock splits along predictable planes. Sediment settles in layered sheets. Tectonic stress creates abrupt geometry beneath the crust. We are warned, gently, against seeing intention where there may be none. And yet, the discomfort persists. The difference between a natural cliff and a staircase is subtle when viewed from afar. It is only in detail, the spacing of levels, the continuity of edges, the rhythm of angles, That distinction begins to matter. Several of these underwater sites were briefly studied when first discovered. Excitement flickered. Media attention followed. Then funding cycles shifted. Research vessels were reassigned. Priorities changed. A few marine geologists have quietly acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Comprehensive investigations were never completed. Not disproven. Not definitively classified. Simply left unresolved. In some cases, sediment cores were taken nearby, but not directly from the formations themselves. In others, high-resolution scans were scheduled but postponed indefinitely. The ocean reclaimed attention. The anomalies faded from headlines and slipped back into professional archives. This does not prove significance. It proves incompletion. And that may be more unsettling, because uncertainty lingers differently than dismissal. When something is declared natural, the mind moves on. When something is conclusively identified as artificial, the story progresses. But when a site sits suspended between explanation and neglect, it becomes a question mark resting on the seafloor. Imagine standing before a submerged terrace that descends in even steps, each level consistent in height. Imagine tracing a sonar image that shows a ridge extending in a deliberate line beneath drifting sand. It may be geology. It may be coincidence. But it has not been examined closely enough to know. If these formations are natural, then nature has constructed wonders beneath our oceans that rival any ruin on land. But if even a fraction of them are structural, they do not belong to the civilizations recorded in textbooks. They would belong to coastlines that existed before the sea reached its current height, to settlements that stood where ships now pass overhead, and that possibility carries weight. Because if even one confirmed structure predates recorded history by thousands of years, then the timeline we inherited is not incorrect, but incomplete. Nature builds marvels. It shapes arches, columns, and walls. Yet the question remains hovering quietly in the dark water. Does it build staircases? And if deeper investigation into these places has been hesitant rather than thorough, perhaps the mystery does not lie only in the shapes themselves, but in why we have not fully looked. Before suspicion takes root, practicality must speak first. Exploring the deep ocean is not simple curiosity, carried out with a flashlight and a rope. It demands vessels built to endure open water for weeks. It requires remotely operated vehicles engineered to survive crushing pressure. At extreme depths, the weight of the water above can collapse steel like thin foil. Electronics must be sealed against intrusion. Cameras must function in complete darkness, where sunlight has never reached and never will. Everything about the abyss resists ease. A single expedition can cost millions. Crew, fuel, equipment, maintenance, risk insurance, each adds another layer to the ledger. Governments operate within finite budgets. Archaeological grants compete with infrastructure, healthcare, defense, education. When decisions are made about where to send resources, priority tends to flow toward immediate needs and measurable returns. Marine expeditions carry uncertainty. They may discover something significant. They may find nothing at all. To policymakers evaluating spreadsheets rather than mysteries, the abyss can seem like a gamble. So perhaps the absence of large-scale underwater archaeology is not secrecy. Perhaps it is economics. This explanation feels grounded, reasonable. It tempers speculation with realism. The ocean is vast. Funding is limited. Choices must be made. But then a quieter detail emerges. Across the same ocean floor that remains archaeologically underexplored, private corporations routinely conduct high-resolution seabed mapping. Telecommunications companies chart precise routes for fiber, optic cables that carry global data. Energy firms scan wide swaths of continental shelves for oil and gas. Mining consortia survey mineral-rich zones, thousands of meters below the surface. These operations are not casual. They rely on advanced multi-beam sonar systems, capable of rendering detailed bathymetric images. Sub-bottom profilers penetrate sediment layers to reveal structures hidden beneath. Autonomous vehicles sweep grids methodically, collecting data with remarkable precision. In specific corridors of the ocean, mapping resolution is exceptional. The technology exists. The capacity exists. The expertise exists. When profit depends on knowledge of the seabed becomes visible. This is not accusation. It is contrast. Archaeological exploration struggles for funding, while commercial mapping proceeds wherever economic incentive points. The ocean is not uniformly mysterious. It is selectively illuminated. In areas slated for undersea cables, the contours of the seabed are known intimately. In zones targeted for mineral extraction, geological layers are studied carefully. Engineers demand clarity before investment. And so a subtle tension forms. If humanity can survey the abyss to extract resources, then inability cannot fully explain limited archaeological effort. The tools are present. The vessels are built. The data streams flow continuously across corporate servers. The difference lies not in capability, but in intention. This does not imply that important discoveries are being concealed. It suggests something quieter, and perhaps more ordinary. Exploration follows incentive. When revenue is measurable, effort accelerates. When memory is intangible, urgency softens. The ocean floor does not resist us because it is unreachable. It resists because it is expensive to reach without financial return. And so the question shifts gently in the mind. It is no longer, can we look beneath the sea? It becomes, what do we choose to look for? Infrastructure receives investment because it connects markets. Mineral surveys receive funding because they promise output. Historical investigation, by comparison, offers insight rather than revenue. If civilization's earliest coastal settlements now rest beneath sediment, their recovery would not immediately generate profit. It would expand understanding. It would reshape narrative. And narrative does not appear on a quarterly report. So perhaps the abyss is not ignored. It is prioritized differently. If economic shapes which parts of the ocean become clear and which remain shadowed, then perhaps other forces, more subtle than funding alone, also influence where attention flows, because when exploration depends on expectation, what we believe about the past may quietly determine what we search for in the present. Human history, as it is commonly taught, unfolds in a clean progression. First, scattered bands of hunter, gatherers moving with the seasons. Then agriculture takes root. Permanent settlements rise beside fields. Villages grow into cities. Bronze hardens into tools and weapons. Iron follows, writing appears. Kingdoms expand. It is a narrative that feels orderly, logical, comforting in its sequence. This framework does not exist because someone invented it casually. It was constructed carefully, layer by layer, from decades of excavation and analysis. Radiocarbon dates were compared, artifacts categorized, patterns drawn from fragments of pottery and stone. Over time, a timeline solidified. Agriculture before cities, cities before metallurgy. Complexity emerging gradually, step by step. When new discoveries align with this structure, they are absorbed smoothly. A settlement slightly older than expected can adjust a date by centuries. A tool that predates known usage can extend a margin. The system flexes within reason. But when a finding threatens to push civilization backward by millennia, the response changes, not because truth is unwelcome, but because stability matters. Institutions rely on coherence. Textbooks cannot shift with every anomaly. Academic consensus requires convergence from multiple lines of evidence. Archaeology, perhaps more than many fields, must guard against wishful interpretation. A misdated site can mislead generations, so scrutiny intensifies when claims run too far ahead of established chronology. Excavations are repeated. Samples are retested. Peer review becomes exacting. Extraordinary assertions demand extraordinary demonstration. This caution is not a barrier. It is a safeguard. History has seen moments when radical claims were first dismissed, only to later reshape understanding. Entire species of early humans, once ridiculed as misinterpretations, now populate museum halls. Continental drift was treated as fantasy before plate tectonics reframed geology. Sites initially labelled too old to be plausible were eventually confirmed when more advanced dating techniques emerged. Knowledge does move. It stretches. It recalibrates. But rarely overnight. Paradigms possess inertia. They resist abrupt displacement because they are interconnected. Change one foundational assumption, and others must shift to accommodate it. If compelling underwater evidence were to suggest organized human structures, thousands of years older than recognized urban centers, the implications would extend far beyond a single discovery. It would ripple outward into migration models, technological development, social evolution. That scale of adjustment would not be adopted lightly. It would require repetition across regions, independent verification, transparent methodology, years of discussion, perhaps decades. And this is where the tension rests, not between truth and suppression, but between evidence and threshold. What happens when data points begin to accumulate just outside accepted boundaries? How many anomalies must align before a narrative expands? At what moment does hesitation transform into revision? The architecture of history is not carved into literal stone. It is written in consensus, and consensus shifts slowly because it must. So if underwater formations hint at a more complex pre-agricultural world, if terraces, alignments, or habitation indicators cluster in drowned landscapes older than textbooks allow, the question is not whether they will be examined. It is how long examination will take before interpretation changes. Because once a story has been collectively agreed upon, altering it requires more than a single discovery. It requires a willingness to redraw the map of origin. And that willingness does not emerge from suspicion. It emerges from accumulation. Having considered this quiet resistance within intellectual systems, the narrative now turns to places where anomalies briefly surfaced in public view, then slipped back beneath the surface as attention moved on. It often begins the same way. A diver photographs something unusual beneath the surface. A sonar scan reveals symmetry where none was expected. A research team releases preliminary images accompanied by cautious language. Within days, headlines bloom across news sites. Words like ancient, mysterious, and sunken city ripple through social feeds. The ocean, suddenly, is everywhere. Initial reports tend to lean toward drama. A staircase beneath the sea. A pyramid-shaped mound off a distant coast. A structure older than history. The images circulate faster than the data. Audiences lean forward. Questions multiply. Then, quietly, follow-up. Analysis begins. Geologists step in to test rock composition. Archaeologists request sediment cores. Peer reviewers advise caution. Terminology softens. What was described as a ruin becomes a formation. What was called a structure becomes an anomaly. The language cools. Funding proposals are drafted. Expedition plans are submitted. And here, momentum falters. Comprehensive underwater excavation is slow and costly. Equipment must be transported. Weather windows must align. Specialists must be assembled. Meanwhile, media attention has already shifted to the next emerging story. The cycle moves on. Headlines fade from the front page. Search trends decline. The site remains where it always was, unchanged, submerged, waiting. Years later, if one searches carefully, the original reports are still there. So are cautious academic papers expressing uncertainty. What is often missing is resolution. Many of these underwater anomalies were never conclusively debunked. They were not dramatically disproven. They were simply left incomplete. A promising ridge was mapped in part, but not fully scanned at higher resolution. A stepped formation was photographed, but never excavated. Preliminary dating suggested intrigue, but follow-up sampling lacked resources. Without definitive classification, the site hovered in limbo. The ocean does not hurry. It can wait centuries without alteration. Media cannot. Complex excavation beneath water can take years of coordinated effort. Headlines last days. In this contrast lies a different understanding of how mysteries persist. It does not require coordinated suppression or sealed archives. Sometimes a question fades because attention, like tide, retreats elsewhere. Distraction can achieve what denial does not. A site that demands extended investigation competes with political crises, technological launches, cultural debates. Funding bodies calculate opportunity cost. Editors track engagement metrics. Public fascination is a fragile current, easily diverted. And so anomalies settle back into obscurity. Not because they were solved, but because they were eclipsed. This pattern repeats quietly across decades. A discovery rises. Skepticism tempers it. Interest drifts. The ocean resumes its stillness. The effect is cumulative. Each unresolved site becomes a fragment of an unfinished mosaic. none dramatic enough to force global revision alone, together, suggestive of something larger. Yet, there is restraint here. It would be too easy to assume concealment. Too simple to imagine deliberate erasure. The reality may be less sinister and more human. Research competes. Budgets strain. Cultural attention spans shorten. The sea remains vast and silent while the world above pulses with urgency. Perhaps nothing is being actively hidden. Perhaps no hand presses down on evidence. Perhaps the ocean is simply too quiet to compete with noise above it. And yet, as technology advances and new tools emerge, some of these forgotten coordinates are being revisited, not with headlines this time, but with instruments capable of seeing what earlier expeditions could not. What was once an interrupted question may be about to become answerable. The story resumes not in the distant past, but on the open ocean under a modern sky. A research vessel floats in near stillness, its deck lights casting pale circles across the water. Night stretches in all directions. The horizon disappears. Above, stars burn quietly. Below, a different darkness waits. The sea looks calm from the surface. It gives nothing away. One by one, machines are lowered into the black water. Not divers, not explorers wrapped in suits of metal and glass, but instruments built for endurance. Cables unwind. Winches hum softly. The ocean accepts them without resistance. At depth, human eyes would fail. Pressure would crush steel beams. Light would vanish entirely. Yet these devices do not rely on sight in the way we do. They rely on sound. Multi-beam sonar sends pulses outward in wide arcs, like invisible fan-shaped beams spreading across the seafloor. Each pulse travels down through the darkness, strikes the bottom, and returns as an echo. Those echoes are measured, timed, translated. Seconds become distance. Variations become contour. Slowly, the flat abstraction of a chart transforms into relief. Hills rise. Valleys dip. Slopes sharpen. What was once a blank blue field becomes textured. Another tool listens deeper still. Sub-bottom profilers send sound through layers of sediment, revealing structures buried beneath the surface layer. It is not excavation in the traditional sense. Nothing is lifted, nothing disturbed. The machines simply read what lies hidden. Autonomous underwater vehicles move methodically across assigned grids, independent and precise. They do not tire. They do not speculate. They sweep, record, and return with memory banks, filled not with stories, but with data. What comes back is not myth. It is shape. Lines appear where none were expected. Elevations change in deliberate increments. Patterns repeat. For centuries, the ocean concealed its flaw by depth alone. It did not require secrecy. Pressure and darkness were enough. Now, those natural barriers are thinning. Entire stretches of seabed are being rendered in high resolution, pixel by pixel, echo by echo. In survey zones, scattered across different continents, something unusual has emerged. Rectilinear formations. Long linear ridges extending with unexpected consistency. Grid-like impressions etched across sediment fields. At first glance, they resembled fracture zones, the kind created by shifting tectonic plates. Geologists marked them as probable geological features. But when closer imaging was performed, when the sonar passed back and forth with tighter frequency and greater precision, the regularity began to stand out. Angles appeared sharper than surrounding formations. Spacing between ridges showed repetition rather than randomness. In some zones, parallel lines ran beside one another for surprising distances. No dramatic declarations followed. No immediate conclusion was drawn. The language in reports remained careful, almost restrained. Anomalous linear features, unusual symmetry. Further study required, and that is where the shift truly lies. What once would have required divers descending blindly into crushing depth now requires analysts studying waveforms and renderings. Interpretation has moved from the seafloor to the screen. Data does not gasp, it does not imagine, it records. If a ridge is straight beyond statistical expectation, it remains straight no matter who examines it. If a pattern repeats, repetition becomes visible under scrutiny. Technology has changed the nature of the question. Instead of asking whether anything lies beneath, we are now asking what the shapes mean. The ocean itself is unchanged. Its currents move as they always have. Its pressure presses downward without preference. What has altered is the lens through which we view it. For the first time in history, the darkness below is returning detailed answers. Not all of them clear, not all of them understood, but answers nonetheless. And in one particular region, where these linear impressions converged near what was once an ancient river mouth, the images became too consistent to ignore. Far from busy shipping lanes, beyond sight of any coastline, a broad continental shelf stretches beneath hundreds of feet of water. Today it is quiet, a plain of sediment interrupted only by gentle rises and shallow troughs. But 12,000 years ago, when the last ice age still held much of the world's water in frozen reserve, this shelf was dry land. It would not have looked barren. Lower sea levels exposed vast plains, where river systems cut through soil and stone, before meeting distant horizons. Fresh water would have flowed across that ground. Vegetation would have followed, animals would have gathered, and where animals and water converge, humans tend to remain. Geological reconstructions confirm that this region once sat comfortably within habitable climate zones. It was not a marginal edge, it was usable terrain. The sonar that revealed its anomalies was not searching for history. It was commissioned for pipeline routing and mineral assessment, routine industrial surveys efficient and methodical. Multi-beam scans swept across the seabed in wide arcs, capturing contour data without expectation of surprise. Then the lines appeared. Long, straight ridges ran parallel for unexpected distances. Rectangular depressions formed faint but noticeable outlines beneath layers of silt. The spacing between certain features repeated with unsettling consistency, as though guided by proportion rather than accident. At first, these shapes were logged as geological irregularities. Continental shelves bear scars of erosion and shifting sediment. Fracture zones can produce deceptive geometry. There was no immediate cause for alarm. But the surveys continued. Higher resolution passes retraced the same corridors. The patterns persisted. In some areas, alignments followed directional bearings with surprising precision. Angles met with consistency rarely associated with random seabed contouring. The impression was not of chaos frozen in rock, but of order softened by time. Still, caution dominated interpretation. Geologists examined core samples, taken near the ridges. They studied grain size, compaction, organic traces embedded within the sediment layers. And this is where the analysis took an unexpected turn. Certain formations lay beneath marine sediment, deposits dated to several thousand years after sea levels reached their current height. In other words, the ridges were not recently shaped underwater. They existed before the silt above them began to settle. They predated submersion. The implication did not arrive loudly. It emerged in quiet technical language within internal reports. If the sediment chronology is accurate, then at least some of the observed formations were already present when this land stood above sea level. The ocean did not sculpt them from nothing. It covered them. That distinction matters. A structure formed beneath waves can be explained through underwater geological processes. A formation that existed before water claimed the shelf must have been shaped in open air, exposed to weather, wind perhaps, even human presence. No declaration was made that these were buildings. No official statement labelled them infrastructure. The findings required further testing, wider sampling, more exhaustive review. But the gravity settled gently in the room where the data was examined. If these features originated on dry land, and if their geometry cannot be fully accounted for by natural fracture patterns, then they belong to an earlier landscape, one that supported life before retreating beneath rising seas. What stood there? A river delta feeding into an ancient coastline, plains fertile enough to sustain settlements, roots carved through terrain that now lies silent under pressure. The shelf that was presumed empty may never have been empty at all. It may have carried pathways, boundaries, foundations softened by centuries of tidal, current, and drifting sand. No towers remain, no intact walls break the surface. Only shapes linger, subtle and weathered. And if one continental shelf preserves such echoes, the question widens almost inevitably. How many other drowned plains, across distant oceans, hold patterns that simply have not yet been examined closely enough to be recognized? The view widens. What first appeared as a singular anomaly on one continental shelf begins to echo in other regions, different oceans, different hemispheres. thousands of miles apart, separated by currents and climates that rarely intersect. And yet, when researchers begin comparing datasets, something quietly familiar emerges. The formations are not identical. There are no matching blueprints, no mirrored coastlines. One site reveals broad steppe, like terraces descending toward what was once a river mouth. Another displays elongated ridges running in parallel bands beneath layered sediment. In a third region, symmetrical mounds cluster near the edge of a submerged floodplain. Individually, each site can be debated. Nature is versatile. Rock breaks in patterns. Sediment compacts unevenly. Coincidence exists. But when the camera metaphorically pulls back, when sonar maps from distant margins are placed side by side, a recurring theme surfaces. These anomalies consistently appear in zones that during lower sea levels were habitable plains. They cluster near paleo, river systems, ancient waterways now traced only through digital reconstruction. Rivers that once carved paths across open land still leave faint signatures beneath the sea. Their channels are preserved like scars, winding across continental shelves. Where rivers met the ocean, early human settlement would have been likely. Access to fresh water, fertile soil, migration routes. Even in the absence of agriculture, river valleys provide stability. Comparison of sonar datasets reveals something more subtle than shape alone: orientation. In multiple regions, linear features align relative to reconstructed river courses in comparable ways. Terraces appear positioned along former elevations, just above floodplain boundaries. Corridors seem to trace gentle rises, parallel to ancient water flow. No two sites are exact copies. They are variations within a theme. If these were geological formations, shaped randomly by underwater processes, alignment would not consistently correlate with paleo. River geography. The repetition across continents complicates easy dismissal. It does not prove intention. It suggests probability. The ocean did not erase these river valleys when sea levels rose. It filled them. It preserved their contours beneath layers of sediment. The plains that once bordered them lie intact, only hidden from casual view. If early communities followed river systems, as humans have done across recorded history, then infrastructure would most logically appear along those corridors. Not monumental cities in the middle of nowhere, but subtle shaping of land along predictable lines. The pattern becomes almost whisper, like an implication. Not a single lost civilization, gleaming and dramatic, but multiple coastal societies living along different shores, separated by geography, yet shaped by similar environmental logic. If such communities existed before rising seas redrew maps, their remains would now rest precisely where these anomalies appear. And that is where scale shifts the tension. One submerged site can be dismissed as curiosity. Two can be coincidence. But when separated continents reveal comparable anomalies clustered around drowned river systems, the question deepens. What if the story is not local? What if these are fragments of parallel developments across different regions, emerging at similar climatic windows during the gradual stabilization after the Ice Age? Perhaps what we call the beginning of civilization, the moment when cities rose inland and writing emerged, was not the first attempt at organized life. Perhaps it was the second draft. The ocean floor, long perceived as empty between tectonic scars and drifting sand, begins to resemble something else. Not a single mystery waiting for discovery, but a distributed archive. A record fragmented by water scattered across continental margins, preserved not by intention but by geology. What if the same quiet story is buried off every coast? And if evidence is accumulating in patterns rather than in isolation, why does the idea still feel so radical? That discomfort does not come from the seabed. It comes from us. Before asking what lies beneath the ocean, it may be necessary to ask a quieter question. First, what do we mean when we say civilization? The word carries weight. It brings to mind stone cities, towering walls, written symbols pressed into clay. It suggests agriculture, surplus, hierarchy, metallurgy. It implies scale and permanence, something grand enough to endure. But that definition is not timeless. It is constructed from what survived. For generations, textbooks described early humans as scattered bands of hunters and gatherers, moving constantly, living lightly, leaving little behind. Civilization, according to that narrative, began only once agriculture anchored people to one place. Fields first, then villages, then cities. It feels neat. Yet human cognition did not awaken suddenly with the first planted seed. For tens of thousands of years before organized farming, our ancestors demonstrated planning, cooperation, artistry, and innovation. They built shelters, they crafted complex tools, they navigated coastlines, and crossed open water long before the rise of urban centers. Social sophistication does not leave monuments by default. It leaves patterns. In recent decades, land-based discoveries have begun gently pushing established timelines backward. Large, organized construction projects, once thought impossible for pre-agricultural societies, have been uncovered. Massive stone arrangements dated earlier than expected. Coordinated labor that implied shared belief systems and communal design. These findings did not destroy the existing timeline. They expanded it. They revealed that the category of primitive was often more assumption than evidence. When presented with undeniable dating results, academia adapted. Carefully, methodically. What once seemed implausible became integrated after replication and review. Complexity, it turns out, does not wait politely for agriculture to give it permission. This quiet shift on land matters profoundly for what may lie beneath water. If organized construction occurred earlier than once believed, before widespread farming, before urban permanence, then early societies may have possessed forms of complexity that did not resemble later city. States their settlements may have been flexible, their structures modest but intentional, their networks coastal rather than inland. And where would such communities most logically thrive? Along rivers and shorelines. Regions where food was abundant without intensive agriculture, where transport was fluid, where water provided both sustenance and movement. Those are precisely the landscapes now submerged beneath continental shelves. If early organized groups existed before the full flowering of inland urban civilization, some of them would have occupied coastal plains during lower sea levels. Their dwellings may not have rivaled later stone cities, but they may have shaped land in subtle, deliberate ways, terracing slopes, marking pathways, establishing shared spaces. When seas rose gradually, those zones disappeared beneath salt water. What survived on higher ground inland shaped the next chapters of history. What vanished offshore became absent from the narrative. So perhaps our definition of civilization has been influenced by geography as much as by development. We define complexity by what remains visible. But absence does not always indicate non-existence. It may simply mark relocation. If archaeologists today can acknowledge that organized construction emerged earlier than previously assumed on dry land, then the possibility that similar or related communities occupied drowned coasts becomes less radical. The destabilizing thought is not that everything we know is wrong. It is that everything we know may be incomplete. The first true chapter of human organization may not lie entirely in deserts or valleys that escape the sea. It may begin along shores now hidden beneath shifting currents. What if the dawn of civilization did not begin where we were taught, but where we cannot stand? And if that idea unsettles us, the discomfort may reveal something about more than evidence. It may reveal something about how we protect the stories we inherit. There is a name that hovers over any conversation about submerged worlds. Atlantis. For centuries, it has drifted between philosophy and fantasy, invoked as allegory, speculation, obsession. The story describes a powerful civilization swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic event. It has been imagined as a kingdom of impossible architecture, advanced knowledge, gleaming towers lost in an instant. Because the image is so grand, it casts a long shadow. The tale has inspired explorers and opportunists alike. It has fueled elaborate claims, dubious expeditions, and extravagant documentaries. In the process, it has blurred the line between geological possibility and mythic extravagance. When the idea of a sunken civilization arises, Atlantis often follows, dragging with it associations of exaggeration. That shadow complicates serious inquiry. If sonar reveals unusual structures beneath water, if sediment cores suggest ancient habitation zones now submerged, the conversation risks immediate comparison to legend. Researchers, aware of reputations, and funding realities, tread carefully. No scientist wants careful analysis to be dismissed as fantasy hunting. And so a strange tension forms. On one hand, geology confirms that sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age. Entire landscapes were flooded. River valleys vanished. On the other hand, the popular image of Atlantis suggests crystalline cities and advanced technology far beyond their era. The two are not equivalent. A drowned settlement need not possess miraculous engineering or supernatural science. It does not require floating palaces or energy beams. It requires only humans living near a coastline during a time of environmental transition. Yet, when myth becomes dominant, it can discredit the quieter question hidden within it. Did communities once thrive along shores that no longer exist? That inquiry is sober, grounded in climate data and archaeological logic. But because it resembles a story long treated as fantasy, it inherits resistance. This is not suppression by decree. It is social pressure shaped by association. When an idea is mythologized loudly, careful versions of that idea often become socially risky. Researchers must distance themselves from sensationalism to maintain credibility. Funding committees avoid projects that could be misinterpreted as fringe exploration. Academic language grows cautious, deliberate, almost restrained. The irony is subtle. An ancient philosophical tale about a lost land may have inadvertently complicated the investigation of entirely realistic drowned coastlines. But separating myth from possibility clarifies the path forward. Plato's Atlantis, whether allegory or misunderstood memory, is not required for underwater archaeology to matter. The ocean does not need crystal cities to contain history. It needs only rising water and human presence. Coastal settlements do not leave myths by design. They leave remnants, terraces, pathways, boundary markers, shaped by necessity rather than spectacle. Their disappearance would not require divine punishment or instantaneous destruction. Slow submersion would suffice. So the line becomes clear. Romantic myth imagines grandeur lost in a single night. Sober possibility suggests communities gradually displaced by steady tides. Owen belongs to legend. The other belongs to geology. And when that distinction is allowed to stand without embellishment, the question regains legitimacy. Did myth discredit a question that deserved investigation? With the shadow of Atlantis set aside, what remains is not fantasy, but probability. Landscapes were drowned. People likely lived upon them. The final step, then, is not to argue whether myths were literal. It is to consider what it would mean, quietly, seriously, if portions of humanity's earliest organization now rest beneath salt water, waiting not for belief, but for patient examination. The pace slows here. The questions no longer surge forward, they settle. Imagine, for a moment, that credible underwater investigation confirms what has so far only been suggested. Not a mythic empire. Not impossible technology, but organized human settlements along coastlines far older than our recorded cities. Terraces shaped deliberately. Pathways laid across now. Submerged plains. Habitation zones dating back beyond the thresholds printed in textbooks. What would shift? Textbooks would not collapse. They would expand. Migration theories would stretch to account for coastal networks lost to rising seas. The arc of human progress would lengthen, not fracture. The beginning would move backward quietly, giving our species a deeper horizon. It would not diminish what came later. It would add another chapter before it. The revelation would not thunder. It would unfold across academic journals and conference rooms. Dates would be re-examined, terminology refined. A new category might emerge, coastal complexity before inland permanence, and beneath the adjustment, a gentler realization would settle. Perhaps humanity's forgotten more than it remembers, not because knowledge was burned or erased by deliberate hand, but because geography shifted, because shorelines migrated, because generations relocated inland and memory thinned with distance from water. When seas rise gradually, displacement becomes normal. Adaptation replaces nostalgia. Stories change shape. Practical needs overshadow remembrance of places slowly surrendered to tide. Over centuries, a drowned homeland may fade from narrative, not because it lacked importance, but because it became unreachable. The ocean, in that sense, is not an adversary, it is an archive. Layer by layer, it preserves what lies beneath. Sediment protects as much as it conceals. River valleys remain intact in outline. Plains maintain their contours. Structures, if they existed, are not erased instantly. They are softened, covered, held. The absence of monuments above water does not automatically imply absence of sophistication below it. This is not a story about suppressed truth. It is a story about incomplete perspective. Human history has always been written from surviving ground. If new tools allow us to see further, then revision is not scandal. It is maturation. Yet, there is something psychologically unsettling about extending our timeline backward into submerged territory. Certainty feels safer when beginnings are clear and bounded. A concise origin story is easier to hold than a layered one. The notion that our earliest organized chapters may lie hidden beneath water challenges the feeling that we stand at the apex of full understanding. It invites humility. If the sea were to return fragments of our deeper past, aligned terraces, preserved floodplains, traces of deliberate shaping, would we accept them calmly, or would we hesitate, clinging to the comfort of the narrative we inherited? Because the deeper question may not be what lies beneath the ocean that we refuse to investigate. It may be whether we are prepared to recognize what we find. If the sea returns our past to us, will we recognize it? The tide of inquiry now shifts from speculation to action. Modern expeditions are already revisiting submerged sites with renewed seriousness, guided not by legend, but by accumulating evidence. The vessel did not leave port in search of ancient ruins. Its itinerary listed coordinates, cable routes, environmental benchmarks. The mission was technical, precise, practical. Resource mapping, infrastructure assessment, data collection to support projects that would connect cities and transmit signals beneath the sea. On deck, the mood was professional rather than adventurous. Engineers monitored systems. Operators calibrated instruments. Weather conditions were logged in quiet routine. The ocean was simply a workplace, vast, complex, but familiar. When the sonar arrays were lowered, no one anticipated surprise. Multi-beam pulses swept outward, sketching the seabed in measured increments. On screen, familiar textures began forming, uneven ridges, sediment waves, scattered rock clusters shaped by time and current. Then something different appeared, a cluster of lines, not dramatic at first, not glaringly artificial, just a set of straight segments intersecting in a region, otherwise dominated by irregular stone formations. The operator zoomed in, adjusted contrast, ran the sweep again. The lines remained. It was catalogued as an anomaly, an unusual feature requiring further examination, likely geological in origin. No announcement was made. No excitement rippled through the ship. Data teams are trained to treat irregularity calmly. Another pass was scheduled. The vessel adjusted course slightly. The sonar traced the same corridor from a different angle. Once again, the shapes appeared. Linear ridges, edges that met with angles sharper than expected for natural fracture zones in that area. The crew leaned closer to their screens. They were not treasure hunters. No one whispered about lost cities. These were technicians accustomed to anomalies, glitches in data, unexpected contours caused by shifting sediment. Skepticism came easily, but repetition complicates dismissal. A third sweep confirmed the geometry. The surrounding seabed retained its chaotic profile, while the cluster maintained structure. Parallel lines ran beside one another with spacing that felt deliberate rather than random. Summono accessed archived bathymetric data from years earlier, collected during a previous survey of the same region. The older scans were grainier, lower in resolution. The same coordinates showed faint irregularities, dismissed at the time as noise. The technology then had not been sensitive enough to clarify shape. The files had been archived. Now, placed beside the current imagery, those earlier traces aligned unsettlingly well. It was not proof, it was pattern recognition. The room grew quieter. Higher fidelity imaging continued throughout the night. Sonar frequencies were adjusted to sharpen returns. Each refinement pulled more clarity from the dark. What once resembled scattered fractures began to hold cohesion. Straight segments extended further than initially thought. Corners appeared where slope met slope in consistent degrees. The cluster was not singular, but organized within a confined zone. Still, no one declared significance. Caution remained dominant. There were geological explanations yet to be tested. Sediment displacement could exaggerate angles. Fault lines can create illusion, and yet the persistence of symmetry refused to dissolve. For years, the anomaly had existed in low resolution, visible only as a vague distortion. It had not been pursued because it did not demand attention. With sharper tools, ambiguity receded. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled. Sometimes the past is not uncovered by intention. It intrudes quietly into unrelated work. A routine survey becomes an unplanned window. A mission devoted to infrastructure encounters something far older than cables or pipelines. They were not looking for history, until history appeared on their screens. The next step, once anomaly becomes consistent, is inevitable. Data alone can suggest form, but interpretation demands proximity. To understand what sonar implies, machines must descend closer still, toward the shapes themselves, where sediment and stone hold the answers that pixels cannot fully resolve. The remotely operated vehicle descends slowly, tethered to the vessel by a thin, unassuming cable. On deck, monitors glow with anticipation. The image begins as a blur of particulate matter, drifting past the lens. The ocean, at this depth, is not clear. It holds its secrets in suspension. As the ROV sinks, its lights switch on fully. Two beams cut through the darkness, revealing movement where nothing seems to move. Fine sediment drifts across the frame like underwater dust, stirred by faint currents that never truly rest. Then the seafloor comes into view. At first, it appears ordinary, undulating sand interrupted by scattered rock. The vehicle hovers, adjusts position, angles its lights downward. Slowly, the outline that sonar suggested begins to emerge. A straight edge runs beneath a thin layer of silt. The pilot nudges the ROV closer. Thrusters hum softly. Sediment lifts briefly, clouding the camera before settling again. As the veil clears, a second plane becomes visible, a horizontal surface meeting the first at a distinct corner. It is not pristine. It does not resemble a carved monument rising cleanly from sand. The surfaces are weathered, softened by centuries of slow abrasion. Marine growth clings in patches. Edges are rounded, not sharp, yet they hold. Layer upon layer appears stacked in shallow tiers, like broad platforms descending in measured steps. The spacing between them is consistent enough to draw attention without forcing conclusion. On the vessel above, geologists watch carefully. Their conversation remains measured. One points to fracture lines common in certain rock types. Natural stress can split stone along planes that mimic order. Another observes the repeating height of the tiers and the way the lower level mirrors the upper in proportion. The tone is analytical, cautious. No one claims discovery. No one declares artificial origin. The vehicle glides laterally, tracing the formation's edge. The structure continues for a distance, greater than initially assumed. It does not dissolve into randomness. It persists. A decision is made to extract sediment cores nearby. A long cylindrical sampler descends and presses into the seabed adjacent to the formation. When it rises, it carries with it a vertical history of deposition, layered records of what settled over time. Back on deck, the core is sectioned carefully. Strata are examined, grain composition logged. Organic material, shell fragments, microscopic plant matter, is identified in upper layers. Preliminary dating places some of this organic material within a known human era, after sea levels had reached near modern height, which means the sediment above the formation accumulated after submersion. The structure beneath predates that deposition. This does not confirm intentional construction. Geological formations can certainly exist before flooding, but the chronology shifts the frame. The question is no longer only what the shape resembles. It becomes when it formed. If the tiers and edges existed prior to marine sediment settling above them, they once stood exposed to open air. They belong to a landscape not yet claimed by water. The room grows quieter again. The evidence remains incomplete. Core samples from directly atop the platform would be needed. Comparative analysis across additional sites would be essential. Peer review would scrutinize interpretation. But the weight is different now. This is not merely about geometry. It is about timing. Chronology carries gravity. If future analysis confirms that the structure predates submersion by thousands of years, then it emerges from a world that no longer exists above water. There is no celebration aboard the vessel. Only notes taken, measurements recorded, further dives scheduled. Funding applications begin forming in cautious language. Collaboration with international institutions becomes necessary. The discovery demands patience. It does not require headlines. It requires verification. And as the vessel resumes its quiet drift above the shelf, one thought lingers just beneath the surface of conversation. What if the ocean floor is not simply stone shaped by pressure and time, but foundation? If one expedition returns with unsettling data, it will not stand alone. Other teams, perhaps in other oceans, may now reopen their archives, scanning for patterns they once considered incidental. The first discovery did not explode into headlines. It circulated quietly through professional channels, accompanied by raw data rather than dramatic claims. Yet, its existence triggered something subtle across institutions. Curiosity. In universities, research centers, and government archives, old sonar datasets began resurfacing. Hard drives were accessed. Storage servers opened. Surveys once conducted for routine mapping, pipeline corridors, mineral prospects, environmental baselines, were reviewed again, this time through a different lens. Technology had moved forward. High-resolution rendering software now applied advanced algorithms to scans that, years earlier, appeared grainy and ambiguous. Processing power translated faint returns into sharper contours. Noise filtered away. Depth gradients refined. Forgotten irregularities began to stand out. What had once resembled scattered distortions or unremarkable ridges now displayed clearer structure. Linear segments extended further than expected. Terraced slopes emerged in relief. Symmetry, once obscured by limited resolution, appeared more distinct. The tension built not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Owen Continental Shelf revealed elongated formations near the reconstructed mouth of a drowned river system. Another shelf, thousands of miles away and across a different ocean, showed similar parallel alignments in what had once been a floodplain. A third region, separate climate, separate geology, displayed clustered anomalies positioned along what digital modeling identified as an ancient delta. None of the sites mirrored one another exactly. There were no identical blueprints. But when plotted relative to paleo, river geography, a pattern emerged. These features consistently appeared in areas statistically favorable for human settlement during periods of lower sea level. That pattern intensified the conversation. If anomalies cluster randomly, they can be dismissed. If they cluster consistently near environments conducive to habitation, probability shifts. Across at least 3 geographically distant shelves, researchers noted recurring linearity. Formations that aligned with former shorelines, terraces that stepped down toward what had once been freshwater access points. The repetition did not prove intentional design. It complicated easy dismissal. No one declared the discovery of lost empires. The language remained restrained. Terms like further investigation warranted appeared in internal summaries. But probability, once speculative, began to lean. The continental shelf had long been perceived as transitional terrain, a remnant of glacial retreat, geologically interesting, but archaeologically silent. That assumption began to soften. If even a fraction of these formations represented remnants of pre-submersion human modification, pathways, leveled platforms, structural bases, then organized coastal activity preceded inland urbanization by greater margins than currently recognized. The implications did not destabilize established history. They extended it. Human organization would no longer be confined to a narrow window of post-agricultural permanence. It would stretch back along coastlines, now submerged, forming an earlier, quieter layer of development. The narrative widened carefully. Instead of viewing the ocean floor as an empty expanse, occasionally interrupted by tectonic events, specialists began regarding it as potential archive. Not a place of legend, but of landscape. A record preserved through water rather than through ruin. Meetings grew more frequent. Data was shared across institutions. Collaborative modeling projects began comparing shelf topographies worldwide. The tone was analytical, not sensational. Something beneath the water was asking to be re-examined. It was not a single discovery demanding attention. It was convergence, and convergence carries weight. The realization settled gradually among specialists. The evidence may never have been absent. It may have been waiting, archived in low resolution, dismissed as irregularity, overlooked because no one expected significance there. What if the evidence was never missing, only waiting for better tools? The lens now begins to widen further still. If scattered anomalies align across continents, the question evolves beyond isolated formations. It asks whether these patterns hint at something more coordinated along ancient shorelines, an early network shaped by water long before it claimed the land again. Long before shorelines took their current shape, rivers carved across land that now lies hundreds of feet below the sea. They flowed from glacial melt and seasonal rain, winding through valleys that today are invisible except on digital reconstructions. Where the ocean now moves in slow tidal rhythm, fresh water once cut defined channels through soil and stone. Geological modelling has allowed those ancient waterways to reappear on screens, not in water, but in contour. Subtle depressions in the continental shelf reveal buried riverbeds preserved beneath sediment. The slopes are unmistakable once mapped correctly, meandering paths descending gradually toward what would have been coastlines during lower sea levels. These rivers were not minor streams. Some were broad corridors capable of sustaining complex ecosystems. Their deltas spread wide, depositing fertile sediment across plains that, at the time, existed above water. Such zones have always attracted life. Humans, in particular, have never strayed far from freshwater for long. Even nomadic groups followed rivers as natural highways, using their banks for travel, hunting, and gathering. Long before permanent agriculture, freshwater corridors provided reliability in an otherwise shifting climate. Food sources multiplied along their edges. Movement became easier. Communication between groups became more frequent. If we accept that early human societies organized around water on land, it becomes difficult to imagine that behavior did not extend to now. Drowned landscapes. Advanced bathymetric modeling has begun to reveal something compelling along these submerged corridors. As analysts overlay river reconstructions onto sonar data, anomalies begin to cluster. Terraces appear along elevated ridgelines, just above reconstructed floodplains. Mounds rise at intervals, consistent with ancient settlement spacing. Linear features trace boundaries that once paralleled watercourses. In multiple regions, unusual stone concentrations gather near what digital models suggest were river mouths. Individually, each formation invites skepticism. Nature shapes strange patterns. Sediment shifts unpredictably, but when mapped relative to ancient waterways, alignment becomes difficult to ignore. The engagement deepens as comparative overlays are applied across different continents. Ancient river systems on separate shelves, separated by oceans and tectonic history, display similar spatial relationships between anomalies and elevation bands. The formations consistently occupy zones slightly above floodplain levels, high enough to avoid seasonal flooding, close enough to access fresh water. The spacing between certain features follows comparable ranges across distant regions, as though guided by shared environmental logic rather than coincidence. It is not the structures themselves that provoke reconsideration. It is their placement. If pre-glacial or early post-glacial communities settled at river mouths and along freshwater corridors, their infrastructure, whatever form it took, would logically exist within these exact elevation bands. And where are those bands now? Underwater, the sea did not scatter these landscapes randomly. It rose incrementally, covering plains evenly as ice sheets melted. Settlement zones near rivers would have submerged predictably, preserved beneath sediment that accumulated gradually over thousands of years. This even coverage matters. It suggests order in burial rather than chaotic displacement. The rivers are gone from the surface. Their deltas no longer meet open air, yet beneath the ocean, their contours remain readable. And along those invisible waterways, patterns continue to appear. No one claims certainty. No definitive inscription has been found. No unmistakable artifact rests exposed on camera. What exists is correlation, repeated and geographically diverse. The thought surfaces gently. If these anomalies represent early habitation or modification, then organized human life may have flourished along coasts, before later civilizations rose inland, not as an isolated phenomenon in a single cradle, but as a repeated adaptation to environmental opportunity. If the rivers once supported communities whose traces now lie beneath water, then what we call the beginning of civilization may reflect only what survived sea level rise. The rivers are gone, but their cities may not be. And if river-oriented societies existed across multiple shelves before submersion, were these independent developments shaped by similar geography, or fragments of a broader network tracing the edges of an ancient world, now hidden beneath the tide? If river systems once anchored early settlements, the coastline would have connected them. For much of human prehistory, the sea was not a barrier, it was a pathway. Archaeological evidence already confirms that early humans crossed open water far earlier than once believed. They reached distant islands long before agriculture reshaped inland landscapes. Navigation did not begin with grand ships and sails. It began with necessity, observation, and courage. Coastal life encourages movement. Boats, however simple, expand territory. Shorelines provide predictable routes for travel. Tides carry driftwood and debris from distant places, hinting at lands beyond the horizon. When sea levels were lower, continental shelves formed broad corridors, linking what are now separated regions. Travel along these extended coasts would have been easier than crossing dense inland forests or rugged mountains. Bathymetric scans across different continental margins reveal something subtle but persistent near ancient river mouths, elevated ridges positioned at consistent intervals, broad, gently sloping rises adjacent to former delta plains. Some appear naturally shaped by geological uplift. Others, though, display flat sections atop them, as if modified for stable footing. The spacing of these ridges in certain regions corresponds strikingly with distances that could function as sheltered stopping points, natural harbours along a drowned coastline. Not perfect anchorages, not monumental ports, but protected elevations near freshwater access and open sea. Individually, such formations might be dismissed as fortunate geography, but when they appear repeatedly along reconstructed shorelines separated by vast distances, their pattern begins to suggest purpose. Preliminary analysis of stone samples retrieved from multiple zones introduces a further layer of intrigue. Geochemical testing indicates that while compositions vary according to local bedrock, the method of shaping, fracture angles, smoothing patterns, tool, mark suggestions, shows consistent characteristics across distant sites, not identical, but aligned in technique. Certain edges appear cut or shaped along planes that imply similar tool use. These findings remain early. They await broader peer review and replication. Alternative explanations remain possible. Natural weathering can sometimes mimic deliberate shaping, but the consistency raises questions. If confirmed, it would suggest more than isolated modifications. It would imply shared construction principles, spanning multiple coastal regions, during the same general climatic window. The narrative does not leap to grand conclusions. No one speaks of empires beneath the sea. No map is drawn connecting precise coordinates into a rigid design. The restraint remains intentional. Hypotheses require endurance. Yet emotionally, something shifts. Instead of scattered anomalies, the image that begins to form is faint but persistent. Communities positioned along extended coastlines, linked by maritime travel, adapting together to environmental change. Small settlements at river mouths, sheltered landing points along rising shores, shared methods of shaping stone suited for tidal landscapes. A coastline network, not a single city dominating others, but a chain of interconnected habitats tracing the edge of a world, gradually narrowing as water advanced. What if the world's first network was not on land, but along a coastline we can no longer see? The idea does not rely on fantasy. It rests on environmental logic. Where freshwater met open sea, where ridges provided stable ground and river valleys supplied nourishment, human presence would have been sensible. As seas rose, these connections would not have shattered instantly. They would have receded gradually, forcing adaptation inland. The network would thin. Pathways would shorten. Eventually, only isolated fragments would remain above water. And yet beneath the ocean, The faint geometry of those connections may still linger. Terraces near drowned deltas, ridges aligned with vanished shorelines, stone fragments bearing marks that resemble shared intention. The possibility grows not from spectacle, but from repetition. If such a network existed, its ending may not have required catastrophe. It may have dissolved slowly generation by generation, as coasts retreated and knowledge relocated inland. Which raises the final question of this chapter: if there once was a connected coastal world living at the edge of rising seas, how exactly did it fade? Not in fire or flood alone, but in the steady inevitability of change. There was no single night when the sea rose in rage and swallowed an entire world. Instead, the change unfolded quietly, an inch one year, another the next. A shoreline measured in footsteps grew smaller, then smaller again. Children learned to fish in coves that their grandparents had once crossed on foot. Paths that once ran along firm ground ended at water's edge. Familiar stones slipped below the tide and did not return. Sea levels do not roar when they rise gradually, they persuade. For communities living along extended coastlines, retreat would have become habit. A dwelling abandoned near the shore, a new one raised slightly inland. Storage pits relocated, landing points adjusted. Boats drawn farther uphill each season. Generations would have carried knowledge forward while watching their geography transform. River mouths widened. Marshes formed where dry plains had stood. The distance between neighbouring settlements shortened as habitable land narrowed. This was not sudden extinction, it was compression. Over centuries, the outermost portions of a coastal network would have vanished beneath steady encroachment. Ridgelines once used as harbours would become shoals. Terraces shaped for stability would sit at waterline, then below it. Eventually, even the highest platforms would surrender. Those who adapted survived. They migrated inland, following retreating, fresh water corridors. They rebuilt in valleys that remained above rising seas. Skills shifted from maritime emphasis to agricultural focus as new environmental opportunities emerged. But something else would have shifted as well. Memory. A settlement relocated once retains its origin in clear recollection. Relocated twice, the memory softens. After several generations, when no physical marker of the former coastline remains accessible, the drowned homeland begins to feel distant, almost symbolic. Children born inland hear stories of ancestors who once lived where waves now move. The stories change shape. Details blur. Geography transforms into metaphor. The engagement rests here, quiet but profound. If a coastal civilization endured for thousands of years before gradual submersion, its disappearance would not require catastrophe. No universal catastrophe, myth would be necessary. No annihilation, only displacement. Infrastructure would remain beneath water, softened by sediment, but intact enough to leave shape. Descendants would continue inland, carrying fragments of tradition disconnected from the physical spaces that inspired them. Myth might preserve echoes. Ancestral lands lost to the sea. Cities beneath waves. Knowledge guarded and retold without coordinates. Not as deliberate invention, but as memory compressed into narrative. Civilizations do not always fall dramatically. Sometimes they recede. The sea, in this version of history, is neither villain nor destroyer. It does not burn libraries or shatter monuments. It absorbs patiently. Layer upon layer, it settles over terraces and ridges, over pathways and foundations. From above, the coastline redraws itself cleanly. Inland cities rise in eras that follow. Textbooks trace development from what remained visible. Nothing was necessarily suppressed. Perhaps humanity simply outgrew its first shoreline and forgot the ground beneath the tide. The ocean becomes less an eraser and more an archive, holding a chapter that faded as attention moved inland. And if that chapter existed, it is only now, with tools that see through darkness and sediment, that fragments of it begin to reappear. As evidence accumulates and patterns align across continents, the conversation itself begins to shift. What once felt speculative edges toward recognition. In the next stage of this story, acknowledgement moves beyond research vessels and into broader awareness. There are no cameras in the room, no dramatic lighting, no audience leaning forward in suspense, just rows of chairs, a projection screen, and the quiet hum of fluorescent bulbs overhead. Marine archaeologists sit beside geologists. Paleoclimatologists exchange nods with data analysts. Coffee cups rest near notepads, filled with careful handwriting. The atmosphere is focused, unremarkable. It feels like any other professional gathering: routine presentations, incremental findings, cautious discussion. For years, the anomalies had been discussed in isolation. One continental shelf presented rectilinear formations near a drowned river mouth. Another revealed layered terraces along an ancient floodplain. A third hinted at unusual stone concentrations positioned above coastlines. Each was treated independently. Context mattered, local geology varied, environmental forces differed. Today, for the first time, they are placed side by side. The screen glows with reconstructed coastlines from different hemispheres. Ancient river systems traced in faint blue lines across what are now submerged plains. Sonar renderings hover beside them, shaded relief images displaying terraces and ridges that seem almost deliberate. The tone of the presentation is restrained. No one speaks of civilizations. No one references legends. The language remains technical, measured, but something subtle shifts. Where earlier reports described these formations as natural irregularities, the phrasing begins to evolve. Possible anthropogenic features appears in one slide. Alignment consistent with non-random distribution appears in another. It is not an announcement. It is a recalibration. A composite slide fills the screen. 3 submerged regions, thousands of miles apart, are displayed in synchronized timelines. Sea level curves trace upward across thousands of years. The structural anomalies appear within the same general window, just before or during the gradual post-Ice Age rise. The next image overlays spacing ratios between key formations at each site. The numbers are not identical, but they are strikingly similar. Silence settles across the room. Not disbelief. Not excitement. Recalibration. One researcher leans forward slightly. Another adjusts glasses. No one interrupts. The slide lingers longer than planned. Independent anomalies are one thing. Convergence is something else. Questions begin forming. Not aloud, but internally. Could environmental factors alone produce such repeated spatial relationships? Are tectonic explanations sufficient across unrelated continental margins? What would it mean if these similarities extend beyond coincidence? The discussion that follows is calm, almost understated. Suggestions are offered for expanded sampling. Cross-institutional collaboration is proposed. Statistical modeling will need verification. Methodology must remain rigorous. No one claims history has changed, but no one dismisses the alignment either. The evidence did not shout. It aligned, and that alignment carries weight precisely because it emerges without spectacle. This is not how mythology enters a room. This is how paradigm shifts begin, quietly, through pattern recognition among those trained to doubt. The most striking realization may not be the data itself, but the shared acknowledgement that something warrants deeper scrutiny. Years of isolated anomalies now feel less isolated. When independent findings begin reinforcing one another across geography and time, dismissal grows more difficult than investigation. The fluorescent lights continue humming. Notes are taken. The session ends without applause. Yet those who leave the room understand that something subtle has occurred. Not confirmation, not declaration, but a narrowing of uncertainty. If specialists are beginning to reconsider submerged anomalies with renewed seriousness, the question inevitably moves outward. What happens when such careful whispers move beyond conference rooms? When broader society encounters the possibility that parts of its origin story may rest beneath water? The conference room empties quietly, but the data does not stay confined within it. Weeks later, a carefully worded academic paper appears online. Its language is restrained, almost understated. It speaks of submerged paleolandscapes, statistical clustering, and features warranting further examination. It does not promise discovery, it suggests possibility. And yet, once published, the paper travels faster than its authors might have anticipated. Headlines appear. Some remain cautious. Researchers study potential underwater structures. Others lean toward intrigue. Are ancient settlements hidden beneath the sea? The complexity of statistical modeling softens into questions more accessible to a broader audience. Online forums begin to fill with discussion. Amateur historians analyze sonar images. Environmental researchers reference sea level curves. Independent documentary channels highlight composite maps and overlays. Curiosity accelerates quickly once it leaves the pace of peer review. Public imagination has its own rhythm. It does not wait for extended sampling or statistical validation. It responds to pattern and narrative. The idea of drowned coastlines holding early human organization captures attention, not because it overturns history, but because it extends it. It invites people to imagine standing at ancient river mouths now beneath water. But institutions move differently. Officials issue statements emphasizing preliminary status. Researchers reiterate that anomalies require replication before interpretation. Funding bodies decline to endorse sweeping claims, not out of suppression, but caution. Extraordinary revisions demand extraordinary verification. Academic integrity thrives on hesitation. A model must endure critique before it reshapes consensus. Data must be revisited under alternate hypotheses. Geological alternatives must be exhausted. And yet, beneath that caution, something shifts. Several international research councils announce exploratory grants, specifically targeting submerged paleolandscapes. The phrasing is careful. The scope is defined as environmental reconstruction and archaeological assessment. The word civilization is absent. Still, the implication is unmistakable. The ocean floor, once peripheral to mainstream archaeology, is being recognized as legitimate frontier. The shift is subtle but profound. What was once regarded as speculative inquiry is now framed as structured investigation. Multinational teams form collaborative proposals. Remote sensing budgets expand. Marine expeditions schedule seasons dedicated not to resource extraction, but historical modeling. No one confirms conclusions, but recognition itself marks a turning point. The tension remains palpable. Public curiosity continues to circulate rapidly across media channels, sometimes drifting toward exaggeration. Institutions maintain measured tone, careful language. Between these two currents, excitement and restraint, the conversation deepens. When curiosity outruns caution, who sets the pace? In this case, neither fully dominates. Instead, they begin to synchronize. The public pushes attention towards submerged questions. Institutions respond with organized frameworks. The question evolves. It is no longer whether anomalies exist beneath the ocean. That much is evident. It becomes what systematic investigation might uncover when directed deliberately toward these drowned landscapes. And as funding formalizes and teams prepare for coordinated missions, one proposal stands out. A large-scale expedition designed explicitly to search not for pipelines or minerals, but for submerged traces of early human life. The ocean is no longer just backdrop, it is destination. The proposal moves quietly from paper to practice. For the first time, a multinational initiative forms with a clear mandate to investigate submerged Ice Age coastlines, specifically for archaeological potential. Not as an afterthought to industrial surveys, not as speculative side research, but as primary objective. Research vessels depart under coordinated schedules. Scientists from different continents gather aboard shared platforms. Paleoclimatologists map ancient shorelines with refined sea level curves. Marine archaeologists align their models with reconstructed river systems. Geologists prepare sampling protocols, designed not only to test rock composition, but context. Advanced autonomous vehicles begin sweeping vast grid patterns across selected continental shelves. They move methodically, tracing parallel paths that leave no corridor unscanned. Multi-beam sonar captures high-resolution contours. Sub-bottom scanners penetrate beneath layers of sediment, revealing subsurface features invisible to earlier expeditions. What once lived in conference slides now becomes fieldwork. The ocean floor, pixel by pixel, transforms into a topographic archive. Digital terrain models reveal stepped depressions and elongated ridges within elevation bands, corresponding to former floodplains. Survey paths repeat to confirm consistency. Data is shared in real time across institutions, thousands of miles apart. There is no theatrical moment, no sudden unveiling of towering ruins. The engagement unfolds gradually, through careful confirmation. Preliminary findings across 2 continents indicate repeated structural irregularities clustered near reconstructed river mouths. Terraced formations appear within predictable spacing ranges. Linear boundaries align with former shoreline contours. They are not identical cities. They are not monumental pyramids rising from sand. They are patterns suggestive of habitation. Elevated platforms positioned above paleo-flood levels. Stone concentrations that deviate from surrounding geology. Alignments that seem guided by environmental logic rather than randomness. The tone among researchers remains calm. Every feature must be tested against alternative explanations. Sediment layers are analyzed repeatedly. Sample sizes expand. Control sites are surveyed to compare natural baselines. Statistical thresholds are defined before interpretation advances. Confirmation will require years. Yet, something fundamental has shifted. Humanity is no longer passively inheriting drowned history, speculating from the shoreline. It is actively searching for it beneath open water. The scale of coordination marks a turning point, more significant than any single anomaly. Funding allocations increase incrementally. Data repositories grow. Young researchers begin specializing in submerged paleolandscapes as legitimate career paths rather than fringe interests. The ocean floor, once peripheral to early civilization studies, becomes recognized terrain of inquiry. There is an understated dignity in the process. No one claims rediscovered empires. No triumphant declarations echo across news networks. Instead, there is sustained attention, a willingness to remain patient beneath the surface, rather than turning away when uncertainty persists. For the first time, we are not guessing what lies beneath. We are looking. The silence of the seabed has not vanished. Currents still drift across ancient plains. Sediment continues to fall. Pressure remains constant. But something has interrupted the stillness. Intent. The ocean shifts from abstract mystery to deliberate destination, from distant speculation to mapped objective, and, as grids expand and submersibles glide methodically across drowned valleys, a deeper question begins to rise, one that extends beyond physical evidence. If submerged landscapes begin to integrate into our understanding of early human organization, how does that alter the story we tell about ourselves? Chapter 8 moves beyond sonar and sediment. It confronts the cultural implications of a past that may no longer rest solely on land. Imagine a timeline stretched across a quiet screen. On the right, familiar markers appear. Agriculture, the first cities, bronze tools, iron weapons, writing systems pressed into clay and stone. Each label sits comfortably in place, connected by a neat progression that feels stable and complete. Not bold declarations. Not dramatic revisions. Just cautious phrases, organized coastal habitation, unconfirmed. Submerged settlement indicators. Pre-agricultural structural complexity. The line does not break, it lengthens. For generations, the story of civilization has followed a steady arc. Humans learned to cultivate crops. Permanent villages formed. Surplus created hierarchy. Complexity followed grain. From this foundation, cities rose inland and history accelerated. It is a compelling narrative because it simplifies development into sequence. It suggests inevitability. Fields came first. Everything else followed. But history has already proven less tidy than that. Land-based discoveries have demonstrated that large-scale coordinated construction occurred earlier than once believed. Sites previously labeled too old for complex organization have been redated through improved techniques. Communal labor, symbolic architecture, and structured spatial planning appear in contexts that predate widespread farming. The linear progression began softening even before the ocean entered the discussion. Now, when submerged settlement indicators align chronologically with early periods of climate stabilization after the Ice Age, a new synthesis begins forming. As glaciers retreated and climate stabilized, coastal ecosystems would have become productive environments. River deltas enriched soil naturally. Marine resources provided consistent food sources. Communities could have achieved semi-complex organization along these coasts without fully depending on inland agriculture. The engagement does not arrive with spectacle. It arrives with integration. If stabilized climate and abundant coastal resources coincided with submerged structural anomalies, then the first phases of organized habitation may have flourished in environments now underwater. This does not discredit inland civilizations. It does not erase the importance of farming or metallurgy. It suggests that the story may be longer. Perhaps what we recognize as the birth of cities inland was not the beginning of organization, but its second maturation, an evolution built upon knowledge first shaped in coastal ecosystems. Such a model shifts emphasis rather than overturns foundations. Instead of imagining civilization emerging once in a single cradle, we begin imagining multiple zones of early organization responding to similar environmental conditions at similar times. Some of these zones remained above water, others slipped beneath rising seas. The timeline becomes layered rather than linear. The past feels deeper, not more chaotic. Complexity becomes something that ripened gradually in multiple places, influenced by geography and climate as much as by invention. This reframing carries a quiet emotional impact. If early structured communities thrived along shorelines that later submerged, then progress was not born solely from inland fields. It may have been nurtured along tidal edges where river met sea. The line on the screen continues stretching leftward. Not infinitely, not recklessly, but cautiously, guided by correlation between climate data, bathymetric modelling, and archaeological hints. The expansion invites humility. What we once believed to be the singular dawn may have been one visible sunrise among others obscured by water. What if civilization did not begin in one place, but in many, now underwater? As timelines extend, another element demands reconsideration. Stories once treated as legend may require new interpretation, not as literal descriptions of lost empires, but as cultural memory encoded within myth itself. Across continents and languages, stories of rising water echo with surprising familiarity. In river valleys, elders once spoke of lands swallowed by sudden floods. On islands separated by thousands of miles, traditions describe ancestors retreating from coasts that no longer exist. In distant cultures with no contact, tales appear of great waters advancing, of shorelines shifting, of people fleeing higher ground. For centuries, these narratives were treated primarily as allegory. Lessons about morality, divine judgment, or cosmic balance. Symbolic accounts of destruction and renewal. Yet beneath their spiritual framing lies something quieter, memory. Oral traditions have long served as repositories of lived experience. Before writing fixed events onto clay or parchment, societies carried history through repetition. Stories encode geography. They preserve seasonal patterns, migration routes, environmental warnings. Anthropologists have documented how oral narratives can endure for thousands of years when retold with ritual precision. Details shift, symbolism grows, but core events may remain embedded within layered metaphor. Flood stories, when examined geographically, often cluster in regions that geological records confirm experienced dramatic shoreline change during post-glacial sea level rise. Coastal plains now submerged were once inhabited. River deltas once extended farther into open land. This correlation does not prove that every myth describes a specific drowned settlement. It suggests that environmental transition left imprint on cultural memory. Consider what gradual submersion would have felt like from within. Generations witnessing tides creep closer to familiar ground. Marshland replacing pasture. Fishing grounds shifting beyond reach. Homes relocated. Sacred spaces abandoned. Such experience would not vanish silently from storytelling. It would transform into narrative shaped by emotion and belief. Water might become personified. Loss dramatized. The memory of retreat woven into mythic structure. Perhaps these tales were not intended as literal chronicles of catastrophe. Perhaps they were cultural attempts to preserve the fact of shoreline displacement in terms meaningful to those who heard them. When land disappears, story remains. The ocean's encroachment then becomes less a sudden divine act and more a drawn, outlived reality translated into symbolic form. The scale of environmental change may have felt immense, even if it unfolded gradually. Storytelling becomes adaptation. As communities moved inland, separated from drowned coasts by miles, and then generations, their connection to specific geography weakened. What was once a navigable delta became a distant legend of a land beneath the water. Over time, precision gave way to poetry. Memory migrated inland even as settlements receded. The hypnotic repetition of such stories kept fragments alive. Not architectural diagrams or measured maps, but impressions of a world once wider, of territories no longer reachable. What if the oldest stories were maps, not in the cartographic sense, but as emotional cartography, encoded coordinates of loss and relocation, narrative markers pointing toward environmental shifts that reshaped early human organization? This does not equate myth with archaeology. It suggests that myth may carry residue of geography. If submerged anomalies cluster near ancient floodplains, and oral traditions in those same regions speak of drowned lands, the overlap invites contemplation rather than certainty. The world beneath the sea may not be entirely unknown. It may be remembered differently. And if fragments of drowned worlds survive within narrative, then rediscovering physical traces beneath water carries a deeper resonance. It becomes not only a scientific investigation, but a return to stories once told around fires. Stories now waiting to be examined with instruments as well as imagination. Evening settles along a modern shoreline. The sky softens into amber and violet as waves fold gently onto the sand. Footprints appear, then fade with the next tide. Children laugh somewhere beyond the frame. Couples walk in silence. It feels ordinary. Yet beyond that calm horizon lies something no map fully captures. Beneath the darkening water stretch plains that were once dry, crossed by rivers, walked by people whose names were never written. Where fishing boats now pass overhead, there may have been camps, pathways, shaped ground carefully chosen for stability above flood levels. The sea looks smooth, almost indifferent. It gives no visible hint of what rests below. Humanity often imagines progress as upward. Taller buildings, faster machines, signals launched into space, each generation reaching higher than the last. We measure advancement in verticality, in expansion beyond limits that once constrained us. But perhaps there is another measure. A civilization matures not only by building forward, but by looking back without fear, by revisiting assumptions, by asking whether the story inherited is the full one. If early complex communities thrived along coasts before gradual submersion, then resilience defines our origin more deeply than we recognized. Instead of a single linear ascent from simplicity to sophistication, history becomes cyclical and adaptive. Communities form near water, environments shift, people relocate. Knowledge persists in new forms. The engagement here is not dramatic, it is personal. We are not uncovering ruins from an alien intelligence or a forgotten species. We may be tracing the displaced footsteps of our own ancestors, groups who responded to environmental change not with collapse, but adaptation. The ocean ceases to feel like an abyss. It becomes continuity. Where once we saw absence, we begin to see layering. Above the waves stand modern cities, their lights reflected faintly on the water. Beneath them may lie older traces of organization, older strategies for living at the edge of environmental transition. The idea does not demand spectacle. It asks for humility. If submerged landscapes reveal that organized human life extended further along coastlines than current textbooks emphasize, then our narrative grows richer, more resilient, less fragile. We did not begin suddenly in inland valleys without context. We may have refined skills developed at tidal edges long before the rise of agricultural permanence. The sea does not hide our past. It holds it. And holding does not imply hostility. It suggests preservation. Waves continue their rhythm under fading light. The horizon remains unchanged to the eye. But perception shifts. The shoreline becomes not just boundary, but archive's threshold. Investigating what lies beneath is not about proving that someone refused to look. It is about acknowledging that our perspective has limits shaped by geography. The land preserved certain chapters. Water preserved others. The story expands when both are considered. As darkness deepens and stars emerge overhead, a subtle transformation settles in. We are not standing at the edge of emptiness. We are standing above forgotten ground. And as evidence continues accumulating, from bathymetric models to sediment cores to reconstructed floodplains, the conversation must move from contemplation to confrontation. If expanding data continues challenging long-standing educational frameworks, how will institutions respond when extension turns into revision? That question waits in the next chapter, where scientific caution meets growing convergence head on. Years pass. The expeditions continue, quietly at first, then with increasing coordination. Seafloor grids grow denser as survey lines overlap and refine one another. Sediment cores stack in refrigerated storage, catalogued and cross-referenced. Radiocarbon testing narrows margins of uncertainty, placing organic layers precisely within post-glacial timelines. The atmosphere remains disciplined. Technical, no proclamation echoes across headlines. Research accumulates not through spectacle, but through repetition. One shelf confirms unusual terrace alignments near paleo. Delta zones. Another reveals elevated stone concentrations within the same elevation bands relative to ancient shorelines. A third, then a fourth, show structural irregularities positioned consistently just above reconstructed floodplain levels dating to specific sea rise intervals. Individually, these data points are manageable. Collectively, they begin to form a curve. Statistical modeling introduces clarity. When anomalies are plotted against habitable elevation bands from post-Ice Age climate stabilization periods, clustering becomes difficult to ignore. The formations are not scattered randomly across continental shelves. They appear repeatedly within narrow vertical ranges that once corresponded to dry, accessible ground. This is no longer a single curiosity, nor two, it is recurrence. The language in internal discussions shifts again. Probabilities replace hesitations. Terms like non-random distribution appear with greater frequency. Geological countermodels are tested and retested. It is not that geological processes are incapable of producing linear features. It is that producing them repeatedly within consistent elevation windows across separate continental margins strains coincidence. Then comes the synthesis. A comprehensive peer-reviewed paper compiles findings from multiple shelves. It does not claim discovery of cities. It avoids romantic phrasing. Its tone is measured and meticulous. And yet, within its restrained paragraphs, one line stands out. Certain submerged formations, it concludes, are unlikely to be entirely geological in origin. The recommendation follows full archaeological excavation classification for select sites, pending further sampling. The phrasing is careful, conservative, yet it is historic. No sirens follow publication. No broadcast declares a turning point. Instead, the paper circulates through academic networks. Researchers download and read in silence. Margins fill with notes. Email threads begin with cautious inquiries rather than celebration. The room of quiet recalibration widens beyond a single conference hall. Across institutions, skepticism begins transforming shape. It does not vanish, it redirects. The question shifts from whether anomalies are worth attention to how best to investigate them. Funding committees reconsider proposals once deemed marginal. Graduate students cite the synthesis in theses exploring submerged paleolandscapes. Marine archaeology syllabi include new sections devoted to continental shelf analysis. The tone remains grounded. Years of verification still lie ahead. Excavations, where possible, will require extraordinary logistical coordination. Alternative explanations must be exhausted. But something has crossed a threshold. When anomaly becomes pattern, disbelief becomes heavier than possibility. Data that once appeared incidental has refused to disappear. It has grown denser, clearer, more consistent under scrutiny. It has survived methodological challenge and intercontinental comparison. There is subtle tension in the aftermath. No established timeline collapses overnight. No textbook is rewritten in haste. Yet, the existence of replicable clustering within drowned habitable zones cannot simply be relegated to curiosity. Skepticism must evolve. Dismissal gives way to investigation. And once evidence reaches critical mass, a new question emerges, not about sonar or sediment, but about structure. How do institutions built upon long-standing frameworks respond when those frameworks begin to stretch? The next chapter moves from accumulating data toward educational and cultural adaptation. If the past grows longer beneath the sea, how will the story taught above it adjust? Classrooms carry a quiet authority. Chalk dust settles. Projectors hum on whiteboards and screens. Timelines stretch across centuries in tidy segments. Students memorize transitions, foraging to farming, villages to cities, stone to bronze to iron. The sequence feels established, almost permanent. Educational frameworks are not designed to shift with every new suggestion. They move carefully, waiting for convergence and confirmation. Before a chapter changes, committees deliberate. Before a new date enters a syllabus, consensus must harden. This caution protects coherence. History has evolved before. Migration maps, once drawn as simple arrows across continents, were later redrawn in branching patterns as DNA evidence refined them. Dates of early habitation in distant regions have shifted backward by thousands of years with improved methods. Even continental configurations were reconsidered when tectonic theory matured. Change in academia is rarely explosive. It accumulates until revision becomes inevitable. In university departments and curriculum boards, a new phrase begins circulating quietly. Pre-agricultural coastal complexity. It appears first in conference programs, then in grant proposals. Finally, in draft syllabi under elective modules. The wording is provisional, careful. It does not claim a lost civilization beneath the sea. It suggests an area of inquiry. Committees discuss the implications. Should early human organization be framed strictly around agriculture? Or should environmental zones, coastal ecosystems, river deltas, be acknowledged as parallel incubators of structured community life? Debate remains measured. No one proposes discarding the role of farming. It remains transformative, shaping surplus, hierarchy, and urban density. Cities, metallurgy, writing. These milestones remain essential. But perhaps early organization was not defined exclusively by crops planted inland. Perhaps some forms of spatial planning, resource management, and communal labor emerged earlier along stable coastal corridors. The tension deepens not through conflict, but through stretching. A linear narrative simplifies instruction. It is easier to teach a clean progression than a layered emergence. Yet evidence increasingly suggests that human development unfolded in overlapping phases influenced by shifting climates and geographies. The metaphor of a straight ascent begins giving way to something more braided. Agriculture remains pivotal. Cities remain transformative. But organization may predate them in forms less monumental, yet still structured. The textbooks do not collapse. They expand. A paragraph becomes a page. A footnote becomes a section. A module, once optional, becomes core material for advanced study. If history grows longer, does it grow weaker or stronger? The answer depends on perspective. To some extension may feel destabilizing. Beginnings shifting further back challenge comfort. To others it feels like maturation, acknowledging complexity rather than clinging to simplicity. What changes most is not the content itself, but the humility embedded within it. Instead of portraying civilization as a singular dawn rising from one defined cradle, the emerging model suggests multiple horizons, some visible above water, others perhaps drowned before writing fixed their coordinates. Humanity's story becomes less abrupt and more continuous, less rigid and more adaptive, layered rather than linear. Rather than collapsing the timeline, evidence enriches it. And as institutional language adjusts and classrooms quietly integrate expanded frameworks, a broader cultural shift begins unfolding. The public, already curious, now encounters official acknowledgement that parts of our origin story may indeed extend beneath the sea. How society absorbs that deeper past, how it integrates resilience, relocation, and layered beginnings, marks the final movement of this chapter. The closing movement of this chapter does not unfold in laboratories or lecture halls. It unfolds in reflection. If evidence continues to suggest that humanity's earliest organized settlements extended along coastlines now submerged, then the metaphor we have long relied upon. The dawn of civilization begins to soften. Dawn implies a single horizon, a precise moment when darkness yields to light. But what if the light did not rise from one direction alone? What if early organization emerged in multiple environments at once, along inland river valleys that still stand, and along tidal plains that have since slipped beneath water? Some horizons remained visible, others receded beneath waves. Both perhaps were beginnings. The realization does not fracture history. It stretches it outward. Civilization ceases to resemble a rigid tower rising from one foundation. It begins to resemble a shoreline, dynamic, shifting, occasionally retreating, yet always shaping the boundary between land and sea. A shoreline changes without collapsing. It moves, it expands, it yields and reforms. So too does understanding. Public documentaries begin referencing submerged paleolandscapes without skepticism in their tone. Academic conferences dedicate full sessions to continental shelf archaeology. Interdisciplinary studies link paleoclimate data, bathymetric modelling, and anthropological theory into cohesive frameworks. The ocean floor transitions from speculative fringe to accepted research frontier. Not as spectacle, as discipline. Students learn that lower sea levels exposed vast territories once suitable for habitation. They map ancient river systems beneath the sea with the same seriousness given to inland valleys. Coastal adaptation becomes integral to early human narrative rather than peripheral. The emotional current remains gentle. Humanity did not underestimate its intelligence or ingenuity. It underestimated the persistence of the sea. We assumed what was gone had vanished. We equated invisibility with absence. The water's long patience disguised preservation as loss. If early settlements were carried inland by rising tides, their disappearance above water did not erase their existence. It recontextualized it. Perhaps we were never searching in the wrong places entirely. We were just standing too far inland. What if the beginning was always wider than we imagined? The phrase lingers not as challenge, but invitation. A longer dawn does not destabilize our past. It dignifies it. It acknowledges that human organization responded to environment in ways broader than textbooks once summarized. Coastal ingenuity may have preceded inland permanence. River mouths may have nurtured structured communities before fields of grain defined complexity. Understanding expands. There is quiet power in that expansion. Instead of defending a narrow origin story, we begin embracing multiplicity. Instead of clinging to singular cradles, we consider overlapping horizons. The sea no longer stands as void beyond history's boundary. It becomes participant in the earliest chapters of adaptation and organization. And as this chapter closes, the tone does not escalate. It settles. If the dawn of civilization was wider than we imagined, then the story of humanity is less confined and more continuous. What once seemed like rigid beginnings now feel like thresholds, soft edges between phases of adaptation. The final chapter will not push outward into greater speculation. It will turn inward. What does it mean for our future to know that our past has always lived at the water's edge? The shoreline looks the same as it always has. Waves arrive, withdraw, and return again. The rhythm feels permanent. Yet measurements tell a quieter story. Tide gauges track increments. Satellites record subtle elevation changes. Coastal cities reinforce seawalls not in reaction to a single surge, but in response to steady encroachment. Sea levels are rising again, not at the dramatic pace of melting ice sheets 12,000 years ago, but measurably, gradually. Millimetre by millimetre, in some regions, entire neighbourhoods now experience flooding during high tides where streets once remained dry. Engineers adjust infrastructure plans. Insurance maps redraw boundaries. The shift feels incremental, almost polite. But we have seen this pattern before. At the end of the last ice age, rising seas reshaped continents. Ancient shorelines migrated inward over centuries. What we called the long drowning was not a singular event. It was a prolonged negotiation between land and water. Human communities endured that negotiation once. They relocated. They adapted. They reorganized around shifting environments. River corridors became more central. Inland plains grew more valuable as coasts narrowed. Knowledge transferred. Culture transformed. Today, something similar begins again, though under different circumstances. Modern cities, steel, glass, electric light, stand near the same coasts that once sustained prehistory. Ports anchor global trade. Skyscrapers tower above deltas that have always been prone to change. If ancient coastal settlements were displaced gradually by rising seas, then our present moment becomes less unprecedented and more cyclical. The scale differs, the technology differs, but the principle remains. Communities built along water must eventually negotiate with water, The engagement here does not lean toward catastrophe. It leans toward awareness. Ancient societies likely did not perceive sea level rise as an apocalypse. They experienced it as narrowing space, retreating boundaries, shifting resources. Over generations, adaptation replaced familiarity. Inland expansion followed coastal loss. Modern metropolises may face comparable decisions, not overnight abandonment, but strategic adjustment, reinforcement, relocation, reconfiguration. The ocean is neither villain nor conspirator in this pattern. It is participant in planetary rhythm. Ice accumulates and melts. Tectonic plates shift. Climate stabilizes, then fluctuates. Shorelines respond. Understanding submerged prehistory reframes the present. If drowned landscapes beneath continental shelves hold evidence of early adaptation, then rising seas represent not only threat, but continuity. Humanity has negotiated with water before. The difference now is consciousness. The water is rising again. This time, we are watching it. We record measurements. We model projections. We debate timelines and response strategies. Yet, the deeper perspective remains humbling. Shorelines are never permanent. They are pauses. Discovering ancient coastal traces beneath the ocean does not serve as warning of inevitable collapse. It functions as a reminder of resilience. Societies survived environmental transformation long before satellite monitoring existed. They did not endure by freezing their geography. They endured by evolving within it. If submerged terraces and drowned river mouths once anchored organized communities, then adaptation shaped our origins as much as innovation did. The realization settles gently. Investigating what lies beneath the sea is not about rewriting ancient glory or chasing lost empires. It is about understanding how deeply adaptation is woven into human history. The ocean does not erase without reason. It transforms landscapes within cycles that extend beyond a single lifetime. And as rising tides mark our own era, the study of drowned worlds becomes less about mystery and more about continuity. If the past reveals adaptability, what does it teach us about humility? About recognizing that even modern civilization rests on ground that is never fully fixed. The camera returns to the deep. Sonar beams sweep slowly across submerged ridges, tracing contours that were once dry hills. Autonomous vehicles drift with steady precision, their lights brushing over layered terraces softened by time. Sediment settles gently across stone surfaces that have not felt open air for thousands of years. The silence here is complete. No currents roar, no tectonic drama unfolds. Only stillness, punctuated by the quiet hum of instruments, gathering data from a world long hidden by water. For much of this journey, the ocean felt like absence, a barrier between what we know and what we suspect. A vast blue expanse concealing answers beneath pressure and darkness. Now it begins to look different, an archive. Layers of sediment rest upon each other like pages pressed in careful order. Each inch marks time passing without announcement. Organic fragments settle above stone. River outlines persist beneath marine deposits. What is buried is not destroyed. It is stored. Open air roads quickly. Wind and rain scatter structures across decades. Forest roots split foundations. War and development repurpose stone. On land, history fragments visibly. Beneath water, preservation behaves differently. The sea protects what it conceals. When plains submerged slowly, structures, natural or modified, were not shattered by explosion. They were covered. When river valleys filled, their contours remained intact beneath shifting tide. Sediment acted not as inertia, but as seal. The engagement shifts inward. What once felt like withheld evidence now appears as incomplete exploration. The phrase that framed earlier suspicion begins to dissolve what they refuse to investigate. It carries less weight now. Investigation has begun, quietly, methodically, with skepticism intact and speculation restrained. Multinational teams scan, sample, compare. Peer-reviewed papers circulate. Classifications expand cautiously. The ocean does not resist. It does not guard secrets aggressively. It waits. What was once interpreted as silence may have been distance, the simple reality that we lacked tools capable of patient inquiry. With improved technology, that distance narrows. High-resolution mapping reveals terrain with clarity impossible a generation ago. Bottom scans penetrate layers previously opaque. The deep is not empty. It is waiting for attention, and attention, once sustained, reshapes perception. Instead of imagining submerged worlds as forbidden, they become reachable. Instead of picturing secret archives withheld by unseen forces, we see environments preserved by natural process. History is not suppressed. It is patient. This reframing carries a kind of closure. The journey began with suspicion, with the idea that vast chapters of human origin might lie beneath water, because no one dared to look. It ends with recognition that looking simply takes time, coordination, humility. The sea never concealed its flaw out of intent. It concealed it because depth demands effort. Now that effort is underway. Terraces beneath sediment are measured. River mouths are reconstructed digitally. Clusters of anomalies are compared across continents. And while definitive conclusions remain ahead, the direction is clear. The ocean no longer feels like boundary. It feels like continuity. But discovery alone is not the final step. Beneath data and mapping lies something deeper. A question of meaning. What does a longer, layered origin story change about how we see ourselves today? The film returns to the shoreline. Evening light stretches across the horizon, soft and undisturbed. Waves roll in with steady rhythm, touching sand that seems permanent beneath our feet. The ocean appears calm, almost indifferent to the questions placed upon it. From a distance, nothing suggests buried valleys or drowned plains. No markers indicate where ancient river systems once flowed across dry land. No signs reveal whether terraces once rose above tidal reach. The surface keeps its silence, and yet beneath that water lie landscapes that were never meant to remain submerged. Plains once walked by people whose names dissolved long before writing fixed memory in stone. Riverbanks that hosted firelight and conversation. Elevated ground that may have offered shelter from seasonal flood. The narration does not insist on certainty. It does not promise hidden cities or monumental ruins waiting to be revealed. It lingers, instead, in possibility. Human history has always been shaped by what survives. Monuments endure in deserts because dryness preserves them. Stone remains visible where development did not erase it. The structures we inherit define the narrative we teach. Survival shapes memory. Submersion edits it. When coastlines retreat, the ground beneath waves exits visibility. Knowledge attached to that ground fades as generations move inland. Geography dictates remembrance. If submerged shelves hold evidence of early habitation, then our understanding of beginnings has been filtered through environmental chance. The land that remained above water became the stage on which civilization appeared to rise. But perhaps it was not the first stage. The ocean does not feel hostile now. It feels expansive, as if the horizon stretches not only forward but backward in time. The engagement deepens into philosophy. If entire habitable landscapes can vanish within geological intervals and be forgotten within cultural ones, then permanence is illusion. What appears stable today may one day rest beneath shifting tide. Cities, ports, skylines, all are temporary in relation to planetary rhythm. Yet the tone is not bleak. It is humbling. If our ancestors adapted to rising seas before, if communities reorganized and carried knowledge inland, then resilience defines us more than monuments ever could. Civilization is not a single, fragile event, anchored to one valley. It is a repeated negotiation between environment and intention. The possibility that early organized communities thrived along coastlines, now underwater, does not diminish what followed. It enlarges it. It suggests that humanity's story is older, more layered, more adaptive than once believed. The water glimmers faintly as the light fades. Waves continue their quiet arrival. The camera remains still. We are not uncovering lost empires. We are rediscovering ourselves. At the edge of water, the sea holds its silence, but not its hostility. If the sea could speak, would it tell us we were here before? Perhaps it already does, in contours mapped patiently beneath its surface, in river valleys traced by sonar, in terraces softened, but not erased. History does not end at the shoreline. It widens with it. And as night settles fully, and the horizon disappears into darkness, one final understanding remains. The story was never missing. It was waiting beneath our feet.